The channel Life of Slice has chronicled many nostalgic eras of media history, and while watching his video about YouTube in 2007, it occurred to me that that's the year I started my first YouTube channel, and the year I started my anime blog, and the year that Gigic posted his first anime video on YouTube, according to the description of his oldest re-upload. Now, Gigic himself also has a video about the history of Anitube, created because of his realization that no one else had been doing it as long as him and was still around. I think it's more than fair to consider Gigic as the first influential or even remotely successful anime YouTuber, and considering that his biggest influence, Zero Punctuation, was also one of my biggest influences, I think it's fair to say that anime YouTube basically launched on the back of the success of gaming reviews on YouTube, if not just specifically the popularity of Yahtzee Croshaw, who inspired plenty of reviewers in all mediums across the internet. Gigic has a lot of perspective on the very early days of Anitube, when it was like 15 guys getting barely any views, with all of the remotely successful creators collected onto Gigic's own podcast, Podtaku. But the scale of what was going on back then was so much smaller than what it would be by the time I started making anime videos in 2014 that I can remember thinking of Gigic as basically the only anime YouTuber who existed, until I found out about Demolition D, who had grown completely independently of even being aware of this whole so-called Anitube thing, which only really became codified in the later 2010s when that whole category of creator became immensely more successful than anyone had been until that point. Influence is interesting because it happens immediately and it also lasts forever. Shit that I saw when I was 10 had an immediate effect on the stuff that I started drawing thereafter, and it still affects the ideas that are in my head to this day. There is a snowball effect with influence in that something can be at one time massively influential, and then the thing that it inspired immediately is immeasurably even more so, until that first thing seems niche by comparison. I think of, for instance, the conversation surrounding how the genre of heavy metal started. Every band which got progressively heavier in sound and themes was drawing on something they heard before, so where do we draw the line on what we consider to be one genre versus another? Black Sabbath are seen as the godfathers of metal because of their low-ass guitar tuning, which came as the result of their guitarist legendarily having accidentally cut his fingertips off while doing work with a table saw and needing less tension in the chords. Many have argued that the band Coven deserves credit for creating metal because they had the lyrical content and the deep dark sound even before Black Sabbath, but they haven't had anywhere near the level of direct influence that future bands would take from Black Sabbath. Maybe these bands were more consistently dank and heavy than any other band really had been up to that point, or had the singularly heaviest song that anyone had ever heard yet, but there's no question that heavy songs existed which could have qualified as metal if they were addressed today before them. So how do we really decide what counts as the start of metal? I argue it doesn't goddamn matter. From my perspective, Anitube has essentially experienced 4 distinct eras, and in its current state it feels somehow still incredibly nascent. The first era is Podtaku, when it was Nino, Arcada, Holden Reviews, other YouTubers talking about anime whose subcounts stacked on top of one another couldn't top the whopping 200,000 that Gigic was wielding when I started investigating Anitube in 2014. In plant terms, I would consider the first 7 years as the seed stage of Anitube. The roots of Anitube started to take hold in 2014 when characters such as myself, coming off the heels of my 75,000 sub success talking about bronies for a year, and Demolition D, who was around 100, 200k around then, started growing our channels in complete isolation of the people who had been doing it before. We had our own immediate and intense influence on another whole generation of creators in the sphere. Demo even more so than me. I mentioned before that I started my first YouTube channel in 2007. It's still up now, it's called Modal Soul Productions, and you'll find that it's mostly very bad sketch comedy, weird music uploads, and total nonsense, which never broke a couple hundred views on a video until my other channels became popular. All of my review and analysis writing was on my anime blog, which is now called My Sword is Unbelievably Dull, which I would oscillate between posting on like 4 to 50 times a month, and on there I developed the style that I would eventually use in my videos. When I started my Brony channel in late 2012, that immediately grew more successful than either my sketch comedy channel or my anime blog had ever come close to, so I went all in on YouTube and I never really looked back. In the early part of my attempt to translate my anime writing into YouTube videos, I struggled a lot with the difference between the kinds of anime fans that I'd been talking to through my blog versus the mainstream audience of anime discussion on YouTube. I had been introduced to anime conceptually through magazines that talked about shows from all eras of anime history, and I had spent a lot of time learning about creators using Anime News Network and following the currently airing fan-subbed shows along with other anime bloggers in the days before legal anime streaming existed at all. Crunchyroll was only just starting to gain notoriety around the time that my channel started, and there's no doubt that the height of its marketing push coincided with the height of my own channel's growth. And my fallout with that company also marked the last time that my channel was highly successful, but we'll get back to that. When I started making anime content on YouTube, the anime fans in my audience knew almost nothing about the medium. Most of them were totally fresh. They viewed me as the expert, even though in the world that I had come from, I felt like I hardly knew anything. But the immediate snowballing effect of influence is hard to underestimate. For every 1,000 of my viewers that might have watched a show I recommended or learned something about creators from my videos, some of those would just dive headlong into anime in the deepest way possible. From the beginning, I've known people who got into anime through me and within a couple years knew more than I did, simply because they were more dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge while I was busy trying to figure out how to keep a career going by having new ideas for videos every week. 2015 was the year that Crunchyroll really started pushing their marketing and getting involved with YouTubers, and also the year that Anitube really started taking root, with a small crop of new creators inspired by the likes of Giguk, Yesu Otaku, who I didn't even mention, but Sage had been like the more popular Anitubers in the That Guy with the Glasses days, which those channels, while not big by today's standards, were very influential back then. Demolition D and myself, including some who would quickly rocket past all of us in success and become their own monumental influences. This is when we got Super Eye Patch Wolf and Mother's Basement, each of whom I met and each of whom credited me as an influence and then shot right past me. I mentioned earlier how Anitube's formation could be seen partially as runoff from the success of Zero Punctuation and of games criticism on YouTube in general. And this second era owed as much success to a few insanely influential media critics such as Every Frame a Painting, whose visual analysis on film was an immediate and huge influence on the way I started talking about anime visuals, and everybody else on YouTube started talking about film. Red Letter Media and all the channels they inspired with their Star Wars reviews, like YMS, both of which were directly influences on my popular videos about Sword Art Online and the Asterisk War. You had Nerdwriter, who took influence from PBS Idea Channel to, in my opinion, popularize the concept of short-form weekly media analysis. And then you had all the channels who were inspired by those and immediately grew hugely popular, like Captain Christian. And of course, there was also plenty of influence coming from the gaming community, whose criticism and analysis scenes were coming to really thrive at this time. And they were offering me by far the most of my own stylistic influence. Egoraptor Sequelitis videos had inspired basically everybody. Errant Signal's in-depth analysis were what first convinced me that my style of writing could work on YouTube, and there were a lot of up-and-comers alongside me like Hero, Gaming Brit, K-Bash, Turbo Button, and many more that I'm sure you've heard of who eventually blew up. This is the period in which YouTube video essays about media solidified as a concrete genre. I feel personally responsible for popularizing the term analysis video, as I've explained in another video on my main channel, but I think video essay has been the more dominant descriptor of the genre, as it's broadened way beyond the kind of analysis that I'm most known for, and is an older term in the first place. Anitube finally grew to a point that I couldn't easily keep track of everyone creating in that field anymore, and people were growing successful in parts of the fan base that I hadn't even realized existed yet. Crunchyroll's involvement in Anitube came to a head with their convention in 2017, where Giguk and I had our funny fake fight on stage, and where their ideas guy Miles pitched all of us on hosting their awards show the next year. When I was at Crunchyroll Expo, I realized that the company had put their fingers incredibly deep into the Anitube community. Mother's Basement was talking to Miles about their agents in the Kiss Anime CSS chat. I kept meeting Anitubers who had abandoned their small channels for a chance to work directly on the company's back end, and by the end of the night, I had gotten myself blacklisted by talking shit about everyone and threatening to spill secrets in a drunken haze. I had my last hugely successful video shitting on Crunchyroll in 2018, the same year that the Anime Man became unquestionably the most successful anime YouTuber up to that point. I forgot to mention Misty Chronexia. That guy had like 1 million subs first, doing like trashy top 10 videos that were usually playing into the sex appeal of anime. And there were also some popular channels that were just covering like big three shonen. And all of them continued growing during this period as well. They had kind of existed during phase 1, but they all benefited from this as much as the rest of us. That said, some of them were really looked down on because they were kind of seen as only being popular because they had started early. So in like 2018, Anitube entered its third era, the budding era, in the wake of the Crunchyroll Awards failure. The settling in of long-form media criticism as a mainstay YouTube genre was happening, and we had an ever-increasing spread of deeper-tier anime knowledge. I no longer felt like there were only surface-level anime fans on YouTube, and in fact, I could name a handful of creators that I am sure have a deeper and definitely more involved knowledge than I have into anime. Moreover, all of the things that I used to bitch about other creators for, I no longer have to worry about because my influence pervaded far enough into the ideology of video analysis, and enough parallel thought happened with other creators with similar mentalities that I'm now spoiled for choice when it comes to YouTube videos. My personal favorite is probably Stevem, who has more than once made better, more complete versions of videos I had already done, and also has many other fantastic ideas, doing just the most complete coverage of anime history. I also have to mention Shabes, whose love and respect for anime and Anitube shines more brightly than anyone's, who has reviewed everyone else's anime YouTube videos on his digest show for like 5 or 6 years before it finally died, in between his own gigantic projects. YouTubers like Hazel and Amelie Dore have been a part of this new wave of uncovering hyper-obscure media artifacts and taking the audience on these sort of archaeological journeys through cultural research. I can't even do justice to the current state of Anitube because I don't watch the majority of what's being made anymore. I can't even really touch on the massive Brazilian Anitube scene or any of the other foreign markets for anime videos, and I've seen new formats and styles emerging, like talking about anime news, giving plot summaries through YouTube shorts, and I also see the evolution of anime YouTube videos outside of video essays, about which their own essay could be dedicated separately. I don't know what people consider broadly to count as Anitube, or even if that concept itself became dated after Gigguk and the Anime Man formed Trash Taste and sort of broke away from really talking about anime anymore at all. Anitube to me, as referring to video essays on the subject of anime, still seems to be in that budding phase, and it's only really just starting to grow a stem, without even a sign of leaves yet. I don't know how big this cactus can get, but I've been watering it with videos this year to see what happens. I think what Anitube has always struggled with, and maybe always will, is the fact that anime hasn't ever really been a monoculture. Most people are just into a couple of shows, and their interest in the medium waxes and wanes with the release of stuff that interests them, or with how much their attention is grabbed by other things. I think anime has always kind of suffered from sharing so much of its audience with gaming, and with gaming tending to inspire more passion and more involvement than animation, and also with the fact that so much anime sucks, and anyone coming to it from a film and an animation appreciation standpoint is going to find everything that they like in the medium quickly and then bounce back to film. Add to that the language barrier, the cultural barriers of taste, and the huge amount of untranslated source material, and it's kind of hard to build a strong, centralized, English-speaking anime culture. I think the problem we've run into is that every effort has been corporate. It's either led by magazines, websites, or services who have their hands in anime money, and they have an incentive to get people to pay attention to more than just the shows that they're drawn to. I also have those incentives to get people to care about more anime, but I don't have the imperative to sell you shit that you don't want. There is a unique position for people like me and for you to define anime fandom, or at least a section of it, in whichever way that we want. So, which way, Western anime fan? Let me know in the comments. And thanks again for all the attention over the years. Check out the many anime YouTube channels that I recommended in my video about the top 5 YouTube videos of 2024, and then I also recommended 155 honorary mentions. When I actually wrote this script was at the start of 2024, so I hadn't seen any of that shit yet. So when I'm saying stuff like, oh, I'm not watching any of the Anitube, I know all the Anitube now. I recommended all of it, so go check that out. And always remember to never forget, anime forever.